Good morning, everybody. Allow me to continue the lecture review on the basic principles of pharmacodynamics. Then later on, we'll proceed to our discussion on cardiovascular drugs. Okay, so based on this outline, okay, I have provided, we were able to finish the discussion on drugs that are classified as protein targeting, particularly those drugs that target structural proteins, and then drugs that targets regulatory proteins, specifically voltage gated, ion channels, carrier molecules, and enzymes. Okay, so for this morning, we will discuss or somehow review the fourth type of regulatory proteins, and I'll be giving a few examples of drugs that are receptor targeting. Now, mind you, class, that there are a lot of drugs available in the market that targets receptors. Okay, so it's very important that you understand the different types of receptors. Okay, so let's first define what are receptors? Receptor is a type of protein. That's why it says here it's a macromolecule, a macromolecular cell component with a stereochemical configuration. For any receptor, the molecule that actively binds to its active site, we call that generally as ligands. And uh, in pharmacology references, a ligand could be referred to as drugs. Okay, so generally speaking, ligand that is referred to as a drug, which is of exogenous source. So this is an exogenous example of a compound. Okay, then we also have those ligands that are endogenous source. So example, we have neurotransmitters in in our previous discussion about central nervous system drugs affecting CNS. You have encountered different neurotransmitters. Okay, and neurotransmitters, these are chemicals important for transmission of signals. So the chemicals responsible for transmission of signals. And generally, there are two types of neurotransmitters. We have those that are excitatory. Meron tayong excitatory neurotransmitters. We also have inhibitory neurotransmitters. Inhibitory neurotransmitters. When I say excitatory, meaning to say that neurotransmitter facilitates transmission. They facilitates transmission. So that's it. Then for inhibitory neurotransmitter, they inhibits or blocks the transmission of signals. A good example of excitatory neurotransmitters are the following: norepinephrine, also acetylcholine, glutamate, and even serotonin. Okay, glutamate and serotonin. So these are examples of excitatory neurotransmitters. For inhibitory neurotransmitter, we have Gaba. It is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter, diba, in the brain. And we also have another inhibitory neurotransmitter in the spinal cord, that's glycine. Okay, so again, the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, it's GABA. Then in the spinal cord, it's glycine. Okay, they are classified as inhibitory. It is because of the ions that uh, enters uh, that enters within the cell. Once of course, a GABA neurotransmitter, it binds to a GABA receptor. A GABA receptor is actually coupled with a chloride ion channel. Okay, kumbaga it is a ligand-gated ion channel. So if this is the GABA receptor, okay, a GABA receptor, it is actually coupled with an ion channel. Okay, and that ion channel is chloride ion channel. Okay, so it is a ligand-gated ion channel. Diba, when I introduced ligand-gated ion channel in our previous discussion, that was last week, that is an ion channel that opens in response to a binding ligand. Okay, so whenever, let's say, a GABA binds to this receptor, okay, example, you have a GABA that actively binds to the GABA receptor, particularly the GABA A receptor, that will trigger opening of the chloride ion channel because it is a ligand gated ion channel. And as you all know, once a chloride ion channel opens, the movement of the chloride ion would be going inside the cell, going inside the cell. And what will happen to the inside of the cell? It will become negatively charged. Okay, and remember, if it is if the inside of the cell is negatively charged, what happens then? Is it depolarization or hyperpolarization? Diba? That is hyperpolarization. And if it is hyperpolarization, inhibitory or stimulatory effect. Hyperpolarization, that will cause, yes, okay, that is inhibitory. Okay, that is why uh, whenever a drug activates a GABA, inhibitory yung effect. Okay, inhibitory yung effect. It has something to do with the ions that is involved. Okay, uh, in that entity. Okay, so for the rest here, probably these are excitatory neurotransmitters because when this binds to a particular uh, receptor, then ion channel that opens, okay, will cause entry of positively charged ion. Okay, and entry of positively charged ion inside the cell, that will cause depolarization, so a stimulatory effect. So it will facilitate transmission of signals. Diba? Excitatory, meaning they facilitate transmission. Okay, glycine as well. Glycine also binds to a glycine receptor, and it's also a ligand-gated ion channel, the glycine receptor. So meron din siyang ion channel coupled, and it's also chloride ion channel. Okay, so it's also inhibitory, no? So kung chloride ion channel yung coupled also sa glycine, upon opening, rather upon activating the glycine receptor, the chloride ion channel will also open. Okay, so hyperpolarization, inhibitory effect. Okay, so that's the reason they are classified as inhibitory neurotransmitter. Okay, another example of endogenous source ligand, hormones and otacoids. Otacoids, these are also referred to as local hormones. And we have four of them. Those are bradykinin, eicosanoids, serotonin, and histamine. Okay. Now let me give you the difference. There's a difference, distinction between hormones versus a local hormone or otacoids. Okay? Kasi you might be confused of the two. Local hormones, they are different from a a natural hormone. Okay. One difference is the site of release. Where are they released? When you say local hormones or autocoids, these are released near the site of action. So take note, the site of release, it's near the site of action, near the site of action. Okay, whereas hormones, uh, once it is released, the effect is systemic. Okay, so again, if autocoids, its site of action is on the site where it is released, for hormones, it will cause a systemic effect once it is released. So kindly write that. Once released, it will cause systemic effect. Let me give you an example. Example of a hormone is insulin. Diba? Insulin. And insulin, it is only produced by pancreas, the beta cells of the pancreas. However, if it is released by that only cell in the pancreas, the effect is systemic. General yung effect systemic, hindi local. Whereas for autocoids, the cells that produces a particular autocoid, let's say the autocoid I am referring to is histamine. Diba? This is an example of autocoid. This is released by many cells. Unlike insulin, it's only beta cells that releases insulin. Histamine, it could be produced by many cells. Example, uh, in the extravascular smooth muscles, in the vascular smooth muscles, okay, and many other cells in the body that produces histamine, even our parietal cells, right? It produces histamine. However, the action, the effect is only local. It's not systemic. Wherever it is released, example, it is released by the parietal cells. The site of action is also on that site. So local siya, local effect. So kindly take note of that. Local, produced. Yes, it is produced by many cells, by many cells there, but the effect is local. Okay, whereas for hormones, only specific, produced only by specific cell. Okay, so I hope you were able to get my point, the difference of the two. So that is why local, merong uh, additional word before the actual word, or actual term hormone nga local, no, may term nga local added, that is referring to the effect, no, effect produced by autocoids. They only produce local effect. Okay, so that's a difference. So again, ligands could be of exogenous source. We also have endogenous sources. So kindly take note what are examples of endo and exo ligands. Okay. Next, when we talk about ligand receptor interaction, it is um, it is much easier to understand the concept using the lock and key fashion, or lock and key model. Okay. So as illustrated, for example, you have here a receptor. This one, a receptor, it is always embedded, of course, in a cell, okay, in a cell membrane. Now, per receptors, as defined, it should contain a specific stereochemical configuration or We are referring to the active site. So here, this portion is the active site of the receptor. That is where the ligand will actively bind into. Okay, so going back to lock and key fashion, okay, for you to understand this, the receptor here will act as the lock, and then the drug will act as the key. So as you place a key on a lock, it will now activate. It will open up and then activate. Okay, activate a particular receptor. So again, once a drug binds to a receptor, it will form this drug receptor complex. And then prior to producing an effect, there will be series of reactions. Series of reaction, that is what we call signal transduction. Signal transduction, and then ultimately producing a biological effect. Okay, so that's the drug receptor interaction. Okay, so we have four types of receptors. We have type 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's review each of them. The same flow, I will first introduce each type and then give a specific example of each type of receptor, and then let's review some examples of drugs targeting each receptor. So let's have the type 1 first. Type 1 receptor, let's review, also known as ligand-gated ion channel. Okay, and it is usually located in the cell membrane, and it has faster onset of response, and that's milliseconds. Okay, so faster onset. The onset that is referring to uh, the production of the effect. Okay, how is the manner of the effect produced at a faster rate? Okay, so that's why it's type 1. It has a faster onset of response. Okay, I have mentioned earlier that ligand-gated ion channel, it's an example of a transport system, particularly a gated channel. Okay, so I have mentioned earlier what are examples of ligand-gated ion channel: the GABA receptor, the glycine receptor. But they are coupled with ion channels. Okay, and for that gated ion channel to open, a ligand should bind to it. Okay, so that's the uh, mechanism how this ion channel works. A ligand is required. So this opens in response to a binding ligand. Okay, so a ligand, it could be a drug, it could be a receptor. Ayan. So example, a specific example, you have nicotinic receptor or the nicotinic neural receptor in particular. For a nicotinic neural receptor to be activated, acetylcholine must bind to it. Okay, so based on the illustration, an illustration showing a nicotinic receptor, you could see here an ion channel. Okay, for that sodium ion channel to open, causing influx of sodium ion, a ligand in a form of acetylcholine must bind to this nicotinic neural receptor. Okay, so that's how ligand-gated ion channel works. Again, it transiently opens in response to a binding ligand. There should be a ligand that binds to a protein in a form of receptor. Okay, for that ion channel to open. Okay, now influx of sodium ion channel inside the cell will make the inside of the cell positively charged. So what's the appropriate term related to influx of positively charged ion? Is it depolarization or hyperpolarization. Okay, so that is its depth or hyperpolarization. Okay, that is sige. Okay, it's depolarization, stimulatory or inhibitory effect. Stimulatory or inhibitory effect. Okay, and with that, you will have an idea what would be the effect once a nicotinic receptor is activated. Okay, so that is stimulatory effect because depolarization happens. Okay, so the effect of a receptor once activated could be influenced by what ion enters or what ion exits the cell. Okay. Okay. So another example of ligand-gated ion channel, as I have mentioned earlier, are GABA, the GABA A specifically, and glycine receptor. So again, for these two, the ion channel that is coupled is the chloride ion channel. Chloride ion channel. So if these receptors activates, how will they be activated? A GABA. So if this is the GABA receptor or the glycine receptor, a ligand must bind to it, diba? For that ion channel to open. Okay? So once a ligand binds to the GABA A, the glycine receptor, then influx of chloride ion channel will happen. And that's hyperpolarization, inhibitory effect. Okay? So take note of that. When these receptors are activated, kapag na-activate sila, yung effect nila inhibitory. Kumbaga relaxant yung effect. Okay? Or depressant somehow yung effect. Kasi negative, no? Negative inhibitory. Serotonin 3 receptor, it's another example of ligand-gated ion channel. And yes, it is also coupled with an ion channel, and that is a sodium ion channel and calcium ion channel. Okay, so obviously kapag sodium ion channel, calcium ion channel yung coupled dyan, there will be depolarization. Kasi influx of positive ions will happen. So depolarization yon, stimulatory effect. Okay, let us also review the location where serotonin receptors are found. They are usually found located in the postrema of the brain, located in the area postrema of the brain. Okay, or that's also known as the chemoreceptor trigger zone. Chemoreceptor trigger zone. Okay, so whenever serotonin receptor in this area of the brain is activated, that triggers nausea and vomiting effect. Okay, so usually that is being triggered during chemotherapy session. Okay, that's why chemotherapy could induce nausea and vomiting. It's because this zone, this area of the brain is triggered, okay, or affected. So usually as a remedy, the patient undergoing prior to undergoing chemotherapy session. Okay, prior to undergoing chemotherapy session, the patient is given blockers of serotonin receptors. So a good example is ondansetron, commonly marketed under the brand Zofran. So uh, I asked one of my colleague uh, who is also undergoing chemotherapy session. I asked her uh, if he or she pala, she is given ba with this cetron drugs. Ingon siya, yes. Okay, but it is given before the chemotherapy session. That is to prevent nausea and vomiting. Kasi again, pag i-chemo na ka, ma-triggered man ang area where serotonin receptors are distributed, widely distributed. Okay, so these are the examples of blockers, cetrons. They're also known as cetrons. They have that suffixes cetrons. Okay, for nicotinic receptors, we have activators. Example, varenicline, lobeline, nicotine. Blockers of it are the neuromuscular blockers. Specific example, tubucurarin. Activator of GABA A are benzodiazepines. Example, diazepam, oxazepam, barbiturates, phenobarbital, for instance. And then blocker of glycine receptor, we have strychnine. So these are examples of drugs, okay, that targets type 1 receptor. Okay. And again, type 1 is also known as ligand-gated ion channels. Again, next. Type 2, also known as G protein coupled receptor or GPCRs or metabotropic receptor. They are located also in the cell membrane, the same with type 1, and they also have faster onset of response, but this time in seconds. It's also at a faster rate. Now, for a G protein linked receptor, what happens here is once the receptor is coupled with this G protein, uh, prior to producing response, secondary messengers are produced. So prior to signal transduction, then biological effect, secondary messengers are initially produced. Okay, and the function of the secondary messengers, they will serve as uh, kumbaga, messengers that will transmit the information coming from the receptor going to the effector gland. Okay, so these are just small molecules, or this could be in a form of ions, and they transmit signal from receptor going to the effector gland. Okay, effector gland. So receptor to effector. So they are secondary messengers. So example of secondary messengers, we have CAMP, CGMP, IP3, and DAG. CAMP and CGMP, they have the same signaling, but the more versatile one is CAMP, meaning it has diverse actions, diverse effects. For CMP, isolated lang yung effects niya, particularly for its effect is focusing more on vascular smooth muscle and also in the intestinal mucosa. Okay, so isolated. So this one is more versatile, more diverse action or more diverse effects. IP3 and DAG, uh, I believe you're familiar with this. Once released, they cause intracellular calcium ions. They increases intracellular calcium ion. And as you all know, ang calcium ion, if they are accumulated inside the cell, that will cause muscular contraction. contraction. Okay. Now, whatever the uh, type of G protein that is being coupled to a particular receptor, that will uh, help you determine what secondary messenger is being released. Okay, transmitting signals and ultimately producing effect. Okay, so it will depend on the type of G protein that is coupled to a receptor. Okay, so we have actually three types, no, of G protein. So let's recall all of them: GS, GI, and GQ. So if it is GS linked receptor or GS coupled receptor, the secondary messenger that will be released or produced would be CAMP, because the GS, it will stimulate, diba? S stimulate the adenylyl cyclase, producing CAMP from ATP. So these are examples of GS linked or GS coupled receptor, the beta receptor, both subtype beta 1 and also beta 2 receptor. Beta 1, they are more distributed, widely distributed in the heart and in the kidney. Beta 2 receptor, they are found in the bronchial, diba? Bronchial smooth muscles. Okay, so these are examples of drugs that targets a beta receptor. So example, the catecholamines, diba? They have affinity to beta receptors. Salbutamol particularly, it has affinity to beta 2 receptor. It's a beta 2 agonist, ang salbutamol. Okay, yung labas, sabas, labas. And then we also have blockers of beta receptors. They are deemed as beta blockers, those ending in olol. Propranolol, metoprolol, atenolol, etc. Okay, so those are examples of drugs that specifically targets a GS linked receptor. Then we also have the second type of G protein, GI. A GI, this inhibits the enzyme adenylyl cyclase, thus causing low levels of CAMP produced. So example of GI linked are the following. Let's review the dopamine receptors, particularly D2, then muscarinic 2 receptors, and also presynaptic alpha 2 receptors. Okay, so we have a group of drugs that binds to or activates blocks dopamine 2 receptor. Those are antipsychotics. Diba? Antipsychotics are blockers of dopamine 2 receptors. Atropine is an example of a drug that targets muscarinic 2 receptor, because atropine, it's a uh, anticholinergic. Okay, anticholinergic or anti-muscarinic drug. It has affinity to all muscarinic receptor, diba? That's atropine. Then we also have drugs that targets presynaptic alpha 2 receptors, the clonidine, methyl dopa. Those are examples. Okay. Regarding the uh, locations of these receptors, the effects of these receptors, these were discussed already in Pharmacology 1. So you can just scan it over in your notes. Next, we have the GQ. GQ-linked receptors. Okay. Before the receptors, please take note that a GQ protein, uh, it is able to stimulate the enzyme phospholipase C. Phospholipase C, that converts a phosphatidyl inositol 4,5 biphosphate to the secondary messengers IP3 and DAG. So I've mentioned earlier, IP3 and DAG, they increases intracellular calcium ion. And calcium ion, presence of calcium ion in the intracellular fluids, that will cause contraction. Okay, so example, of receptors with a GQ or linked, coupled with a GQ, alpha 1 receptors. We have muscarinic 1 and muscarinic 3, postsynaptic alpha 2, H1, histamine 1, and vasopressin 1 receptor. Okay, so these are examples of GQ coupled receptor. And since they are GQ coupled, take note, if they are activated, if those receptors presented activated, contraction will happen. Okay, so let me give you an example. Alpha 1 receptor, diba, they are found in, let's say, vascular smooth muscles. So if activated, alpha 1 receptor is activated in the vascular smooth muscle, it will cause vasoconstriction. Okay. For muscarinic 1, example, in the gastric gland. So stimulation of muscarinic 1 in the gastric glands, that will cause increased HCl secretion. So that's accompanied by contraction. That's why HCl are being secreted. Muscarinic 3, they are found in the bronchi, in the GIT, in the urinary. Puro contraction yung mangyayari. Example, uh, contraction of GIT walls, bronchoconstriction, etc. Okay? So whenever it is GQ coupled, contraction will happen to that smooth muscle or tissue. Okay? Now let's proceed to drugs. Examples of drugs that targets this GQ-linked receptor. For example, for alpha 1, activators, catecholamines. Okay, since catecholamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine, they have affinity. They could activate alpha 1 receptor. So they could cause vasoconstriction, for instance, to the vascular smooth muscle. Okay, dopamine also has affinity to alpha 1 receptor. Okay, what else? Phenylephrine. Phenylephrine. Okay, this is also an alpha 1 activator or agonist. Blocker would include those ending in zosines, prazosin, alfuzosin, also tamsulosin. Okay, phenoxybenzamine is also a blocker of alpha receptor, alpha 1, and also phentolamine. Diba? Those are non-selective alpha receptors, blocker, alpha receptor blocker. Phenoxybenzamine and phentolamine. Muscarinic 1 and muscarinic 3 receptor, a blocker, would include atropine. Okay, so same sa muscarinic 2 receptor blocker, atropine. That's a good example. What else? For vasopressin and histamine, the name itself, no, of the receptor, histamines, could have affinity to these receptors. Also vasopressin. We have synthetic histamine, synthetic vasopressin that could activate these receptors. So those are examples of compounds, drugs that targets these GQ coupled receptors. Okay, so just recall the mnemonics that I shared to you. The kiss, kick, and 6. Okay, so do not forget that to easily recall what is the G protein that is coupled to that receptor. So for kiss, diba, we have alpha 1, here alpha 2, the pre-1, the pre-synaptic. And then we have beta 1, beta 2. So both are GS. Okay, GS linked. And then for kick, muscarinic 1, 2, and 3. And then for 6, you have dopamine 1, dopamine 2, histamine 1, vasopressin 1, 2, and vasopressin 2. Yan. So this will help you. be guided, or this could be your reference to easily recall, okay, the G proteins coupled to these receptors. For postsynaptic alpha 2, take note, it is GQ kasi it's not part in the mnemonics, no, that I provided. Only the presynaptic alpha 2. So just take note of that. Okay, so that is all under type 2. Type 2 receptor. Sige, let's proceed. We still have type 3 and type 4. So let's recall. Type 3 and also type 4, we'll have thorough discussion about these types under endocrine systems. Okay? Because the majority of the receptors that falls under this category, they will be encountered as we talk about drugs that affects endocrine system. Okay, so let's have a short introduction about type 3 first. It's also known as kinase linked receptor. When you heard about kinase, it's an enzyme. And based in your knowledge in biochem, di ba, a kinase enzyme transfers phosphate group. Okay, so phosphorylation is required to activate this receptor since it is kinase linked. It is also located in the cell membrane, same with the first two types of receptor. And the onset this time is somehow slower since it takes minutes. So usually minutes to hours. That's the onset. How is the effect produced? Medyo slower siya compared sa first two types of receptors. And for the examples, we have insulin receptors, the PDGF, and the EGF. Particularly, these receptors, they are important to control metabolism, and they also control growth. Okay, also cell growth, and even tissue or cell differentiation. Okay, so that's the importance of these receptors, kinase link receptors. Again, ang kinase link receptors, it has enzymatic activity. Since based sa pangalan, it has an enzyme. And that's an important component of its structure. Phosphorylation must happen for this receptor to get activated. And then the type 4, the last type of receptor, we have gene transcription link receptor or nuclear receptor. So this time, it's located in the nucleus. So it's the only type of receptor located in the nucleus of the cell. That's why it's known as nuclear receptor. So this the onset of response, uh, it's the one with the slowest onset of response kasi it would take hours or sometimes hours to days. That's the onset of response for a drug to activate this type of receptor. So example, steroid hormone receptors, thyroid hormone receptors, vitamin D derivatives. These are examples of steroids. And please always take note that steroids, they are lipid soluble. Okay, lipid soluble, they could just passively enter the cell membrane. Because the cell membrane, di ba, is lipid in nature. Lipid, yung surface niya, it's a phospholipid. So it's lipid soluble, so they can just simply diffuse, passively diffused. Okay, so recalling all of them, the receptor families, we have the ligand-gated ion channel, the G protein coupled receptor, the enzyme link, and the nuclear receptors. Okay, so that ends our discussion under regulatory proteins. Okay, and overall, we finished reviewing those protein targeting drugs. Okay, this time, let's proceed to the other way how a drug produces an effect, and that's via uh, uh, chemical reaction or counterfeit mechanism or colligative mechanism, or they are also classified as non-protein targeting, meaning to say they do not bind to the active site of a protein to produce an effect. Okay, so no binding to active site of a protein. So non-protein targeting. So that's via three mechanism, and these are the following. Okay, so we have colligative mechanism, direct chemical interaction, and counterfeit mechanism. So yeah, let's review first colligative mechanism. Colligative mechanism, it's one way of the drug uh, to produce an effect even without binding to a protein. So it only follows the principle of colligative properties of solutions. The example of a colligative property, uh, osmotic pressure, no, osmosis, osmotic pressure. Okay, so we have a drug that uses this mechanism, and that is mannitol. Okay. Before that, let us recall first what is osmosis. Osmosis is different from diffusion, although it's a type of diffusion. But what happens in osmosis, it's more on the movement. It talks about movement of solvent. And the direction of the movement of the solvent is from high concentration of solvent to low concentration solvent concentration to low solvent. That is solvent has solvent concentration. Okay, so that's the direction of the movement of solvent from the area region with higher solvent concentration to low solvent concentration. Or if we are talking about the solute concentration, uh, the movement of the solvent during osmosis, it also means that from low solute concentration to high solute concentration, it's the same. Okay, di ba? The area with higher solvent concentration, in that area, we could tell that what happens to solute concentration, it's at low level. Okay, the area or the region where there is low solvent, solute there is higher. Okay, so it's the same concept, as long as we are talking about movement of solvent here, movement of the solvent. Okay, so it's either high solvent concentration, from high solvent concentration to low solvent concentration, or from the area with low solute concentration to an area with high solute concentration. Okay, so same concept lang. Okay, so again, example of a drug that works via this mechanism, it's mannitol. Mannitol, it is classified as diuretic. And when we say diuretic, they increase the production of urine, diba? Diuresis. They increases production of urine. Now, there are two types of diuretics. Those that are natriuretic and aquaretic. When you say natriuretic, based on the term, natriuretic, aquaretic. Diba? Ang natrio, it, uh, it indicates the element natrium. Natrium meaning sodium. Okay? So more on release of sodium ion, increasing the excretion of sodium ion into the urine. That's not diuretic. Aquaretic, it's more on water. Water that is being excreted in the urine. Between the two mechanism of diuresis, osmotic uh, diuretic effect of mannitol, it's more on aquaretic. Okay? So the function of a mannitol is focusing on drawing. It draws water from, or yeah, it draws water towards urine. Okay, towards urine. Kasi being an aquaretic, it will only increase excretion of water. Okay? So that's the function of a mannitol. And it's reflective to its mechanism. Diba? Yung mechanism, it follows the principle of osmosis. It's about the movement of a solvent. That's why yahang gina-draw out, it draws out only water. That's why aquaretic siya. Again ha, aquaretic meaning excretion, urinary excretion of water from the blood towards the urine. Okay, so if I were to illustrate it, let's say I'll be drawing compartments. This is the compartment of the blood. And let's say this part is the permeable portion, water permeable portion of the kidney, the proximal, and the thin thick descending limb. Okay. Uh, this is the kidney tubule. Okay. And then this portion, this compartment, the urine. What the mannitol, or how the mannitol works, being an osmotic diuretic, is that it increases the impermeable solute in the urine compartment. So it increases the solute in the urine compartment, and that would help to draw out water. Kasi usually, ang mannitol is given during conditions like acute renal failure. Kung naa kay acute renal failure, manifestation to a patient is edema. So na siya edema, mataas yung fluid content sa iyahang blood. Kasi may renal dysfunction, na renal failure, maglisod og ihi. So magpundo ang fluid sa iyang tissues, sa iyang cells. Example, in the blood, mataas yung fluid content. So we would expect that in the blood, higher yung fluid content, higher water. So sa blood compartment, that's the region where higher yung solvent, higher yung water particularly. Fluid, increased fluid content. Okay, so how will mannitol works? Osmosis. Okay, it will draw out water from the blood towards the urine via increasing impermeable solute or concentration of solute in the urine. Diba? That's the movement of solvent during osmosis from higher solvent concentration to a low solvent concentration. Okay? Of course, this area would have a low solvent concentration kasi pinapataas man niya yung solute. Kung yung area na yan, mataas yung solute, the solvent there is actually low. Right? So, osmosis from higher, the movement is from high solvent concentration to low solvent concentration. So this area has low solvent concentration. So that's how mannitol works. We'll discuss more about mannitol under cardiovascular drugs. So that's why I introduced this sa introduction part for you to have an idea somehow. Para later on, you can easily understand the mechanism of mannitol. Okay? So again, it is used usually to prevent acute renal failure. Okay? And its effect i- is that it decreases, therefore, intracranial pressure. That's the ultimate effect. If it is able to draw out water from blood to urine, if it could prevent acute renal failure, ultimate effect is it could lower the intracranial pressure, okay, or ICP. Okay, next, let's have the second mechanism, uh, how the drug produces an effect even without binding to a protein. That's via direct chemical interaction. And example would be via neutralization. So this is a chemical reaction, a type of chemical reaction, di ba? Ang neutralization, it's an interaction between an acid and a base, forming a salt. Okay, so you have an acid reacting that to a base. So that's neutralization. So example of a drug that follows this mechanism, neutralization, antacids. Antacids are for hyperacidity. Okay. So example of antacids, Kreml S, Maalox. They have the same generic names. Tama ba? Ang Kreml S, it has potassium, uh, aluminum hydroxide and magnesium hydroxide. Okay. So antacids, example, Kreml S, and also Maalox. Again, these two have the same generic name. They contain magnesium hydroxide and aluminum hydroxide, and then the added organic compound simethicone. Okay. So during neutralization, the substance, one substance will act as the base. Okay. So obviously, the antacids would be the base, then it will counteract the acidity, right? The acidity in the stomach. So neutralization will happen. Then sodium bicarbonate, para asa man siya, for metabolic acidosis. Okay, for metabolic acidosis. Okay, so during acidosis, what happens is the basic ion bicarbonate is very low. Okay, very low. That's why it will cause acidosis or acidotic na effect. Mababa man yung base ion. Okay, so to counteract that, we have sodium bicarbonate. That is just to replenish the lacking ion. Kulang man sa bicarbonate, so you replenish it with sodium bicarbonate. Another example, protamine. Amine, it has an amine in its structure, and in your basic chemistry, amine, it acts as a base. Yeah, because a base, an amine, it is able to accept proton. Kapag proton acceptor, base yun. So protamine during neutralization will act as a base. They are known as antidote for heparin. Okay, so this is given for heparin poisoning. Okay, that's poisoning. So that's protamine. So purely neutralization then. So heparin here would be the acid, the amine, the protamine would be the base. So acid-base interaction. Okay, next. Another way to produce a drug, an effect via direct chemical interaction, we have chelation, or also known as complexation. Okay, so example, during iron poisoning. Okay, during iron poisoning, the antidote given is deferoxamine. Okay, deferoxamine uh, will to counteract iron poisoning, it will form complex compound. It will chelate. It will form a chelate or a complex with an iron. Okay, so if I will illustrate the reaction, you have a deferoxamine, and you have an iron. It will just form a complex compound with the heavy metal iron, forming a non-toxic form of iron, and that's ferrioxamine. Okay, so this time, this is already the non-toxic or the excretable form of iron. The inactive form or non-absorbable form of iron. Okay, so via chelation yun na process. So it's also chemical reaction. No involvement of protein. So it's an example of a non-protein targeting. Okay, and then last, counterfeit mechanism. Okay, counterfeit mechanism, it's another way how the drug produces an effect and then no protein is involved. So example, no, ang counterfeit, it is also known. It is also known as incorporation. Okay, let me have this slide, empty slide, to illustrate illustrate what happens during counterfeit mechanism. Again, it is also known as incorporation. Okay, when you say counterfeit incorporation, ayan. Counterfeit, it is synonymous to the term false, diba? False, peke. Okay. So what happens during counterfeit mechanism? You have a false product, false product or false compound, a false substance. It will be incorporated in our body, and that will cause alteration of the normal functioning of the body. So example, anti-metabolites. Okay, anti-metabolites, they work in the body via counterfeit mechanism. The anti-metabolites, they will act as false metabolites, okay, in our body. And they are actually classified as anti-cancer agents or as cytotoxic agents. So anti-cancer, anti-neoplastic, cytotoxic agents. So false metabolites sila, uh, uh, not the natural ones. Okay, that should be incorporated in cell synthesis. So let's review, how they work. Since they are used as anti-cancer agent, let's recall the characteristic of a cancer cells. So recall that cancer cells, uh, they proliferate. They easily or rapidly proliferate inside our body, But of course, to proliferate, to cell divide, there should be a preparatory stage to synthesize a cell, to synthesize a cancer cell. And one important component of any cell, may it be a healthy cell or a cancer cell, DNA is an important component, di ba, of any cell during cell cycle. So DNA synthesis would be the preparatory stage prior to proliferation, prior to mitosis. Now, recalling the structure of a DNA, diba? It's a nucleic acid, diba? Deoxyribonucleic acid. So it's a nucleic acid. Nucleic acid is a macro molecule. It's a biomolecule, and it has monomers. Monomers of DNA of nucleic acids are the nucleotides. And to form a nucleotide, we need nitrogenous bases. You remember the nitrogenous bases, pyrimidine, purine. Diba? Those are the N bases, the nitrogenous bases. And they are required to produce nucleotide. And kapag nag-complex na, nag-form ng, or nag-polymerize na ang mga nucleotides, nag-connect-connect na, that will form a nucleic acid. So example, DNA. Okay? So at a molecular level, kailangan itong mga natural metabolites to form later on a DNA. So sila yung mga natural metabolites. Now, whenever these natural metabolites are the ones that contribute to the DNA synthesis of cancer cells, that would be that is a problem, no? That would be a problem. Kay natural metabolite naman ang nag-participate. So rapid proliferation of cancer cells will happen. That is why we have drugs that will act as false metabolites. Okay? They look similarly with the natural ones. Their structures, they look closely similar with natural metabolites, but they have different action. They will alter the normal function during the DNA synthesis. So example specifically of anti-metabolites, we have a 6-mercaptopurine, 6-mercaptopurine. So this is an example of a purine analog. Okay. So it looks like the natural purine. So iyahang molecular structure, it closely resembles that of a natural purine basis. But the function, it's different. Its function is different. It will inhibit later on the synthesis of DNA. Okay, kasi false man siya, false metabolite. We also have 5-fluorouracil. Flu. I think it's FLO. Flu. Oh, wait. Flu. It's U. Ikaw muna mag-correct sa spelling. Flu, U or O? Okay. It's U. Murag fluoride. Okay, fluoride man. So, U man, tama ba? U ang sa fluoride. Okay, fluorouracil. Okay, U. Final na. Okay. Uracil. Okay. So, 5-fluoro. Okay, fluoride. So, fluorouracil. So, that's the name. An example of a pyrimidine analog. Okay, pyrimidine analog. Okay, so for its structure, it resembles naman the structure of a natural pyrimidine. Kaya analog siya, analog of pyrimidine. So if these false metabolite are the ones that are incorporated sa DNA synthesis, it will inhibit the process. Kaya inhibited therefore ang mitosis of cancer cells or the proliferation of cancer cells. So they are classified as anti-cancer agents. So no involvement of proteins. It's purely counterfeit mechanism incorporating only of false substances along the biological processes in the body. So again, these are the three mechanisms that a drug uses, okay, to produce an effect even without binding to the active site of the protein. Okay, so overall, we were able to discuss already, no, review the first part, all about mechanisms of drugs action, those that are protein targeting, and then the non-protein targeting. Okay. Okay, let's have the last part. Okay. So let us also review the drug receptor interaction. Let's discuss about the features of a particular ligand and their classification. So take note, there are two features or characteristics of a particular ligand. Once it binds to a receptor, one is affinity, its ability to bind to the active site of the receptor. Okay, and then the other feature, characteristic of a drug, its ability to bind, activate rather, activate or stimulate a receptor. Okay, now because of this intrinsic activity, since not all ligands are able to stimulate or activate a particular receptor, that resulted to two classification of ligands. Those that could stimulate and those that do not have intrinsic activity at all. Okay, so for those uh, group of ligands, category of ligands that have intrinsic activity at the same time affinity, we call that as agonist. So we have three types of them: the full agonist, partial agonist, and inverse agonist. Full agonist, okay, these are, by the way, regarding these three, they have the same degree of affinity. Okay? Same degree lang yung affinity nila. They only differ to their level of intrinsic activity, their ability to activate or stimulate receptor. So if we try to quantify intrinsic activity, let's say the maximum intrinsic activity we are would be 1, then we could tell that it is a full agonist if it reaches this maximum maximum level, no, of intrinsic activity. Okay, so it has an intrinsic activity of 1, effect is maximal, therefore it would carry full pharmacological response as long as all the receptors are being occupied. Okay, and then partial agonist, it would have an intrinsic activity between 0 to 1. Okay, between 0 to 1. So that could be greater than 0 but less than 1. Okay, take note, partial agonist, it has mixed agonistic and antagonistic effect, mixed. And because of this property of a partial agonist, take note, you should never combine it with a full agonist. Any partial agonist shouldn't be combined with a full agonist because it has a mixed effect. Whenever it is combined with a full agonist, it will actually act as antagonist. Okay, so never combine a partial with a full. So example, you have a full mu agonist, morphine. Supposedly, the ultimate effect that it would respond for a morphine, analgesia. However, if it is combined with a partial one, a partial mu agonist, what will happen? Nalbuphine will overpower or will antagonize. It will overpower, it will compete, no, it will compete with morphine to the mu receptor. And it will cause antagonistic effect. Okay, kaya ang mangyayari, lesser analgesia effect. So subtherapeutic yung effect. Okay, if you combine a full and a partial one. So take note of that. And then inverse agonist this time, intrinsic activity is less than zero. It's not zero. It still have an effect, but negative. No, negative IA, intrinsic activity. Because we have certain receptors that even without a ligand that is bound to it, they already have that constitutive receptor activity. Okay? So if that particular receptor then is, let's say, undergo hypersensitivity, kahit walang ligand na nag-bind sa kanya, meron siyang effect na uh, ginamanifest, no? That's constitutive receptor activity. So gagawin ng inverse agonist is just to lessen that constitutive effect. So it also binds to the receptor where a full agonist binds to. Only that it will prevent the constitutive receptor activity. Constitutive receptor activity. Again ha, there are receptors in the body that even without a ligand, without an agonist binded to it, it already carries a particular effect. Okay, somehow, but not equivalent, of course, to a full agonist or a partial agonist. Nana siya effect constitutively. Now, there are cases na nagiging hypersensitive yung mga ganoong receptor. So, kung hypersensitive siya, overreactive ang receptor na yan. So, we could use inverse agonist at that cases. They will just lessen, ipakalma ang constitutive receptor activity. Okay, but not blocking it. Kasi kapag blocking, already, that's the action of antagonist. Okay, antagonist na yun. So, it's different from an antagonist. Inverse agonist is different from antagonist. This one has intrinsic activity but negative yung value. Negative since it prevents the constitutive receptor activity. This one, antagonist, no intrinsic activity at all. It's zero. Okay. So it has affinity but no effect to stimulate, to activate a particular receptor. So we have three mechanisms or three ways how a ligand causes antagonism. So that could be based on mechanism of action, based on type of interaction, and based on surmountability. Sige, let's try to recall. Based on mechanism of action, we have three subtypes, the functional, receptor, and chemical. Functional antagonism, this is also known as physiologic antagonism. So what happens here is the two substances, they have opposing effects via binding on different receptors. Example, epinephrine and histamine. Epinephrine, di ba recall, it is an example of a catechol amine. Okay, it's an adrenergic neurotransmitter. It has affinity to beta 1, beta 2, and even alpha 1 receptor. Histamine receptor, of course, it has affinity to histamine 1 and even histamine 2 receptor. Okay? Now, let's say, for example, let me extract one receptor where these drugs bind. Let's say alpha 1, let's say for epinephrine. Epinephrine, it has affinity to alpha 1. Alpha 1 receptors, they are widely distributed in the vascular smooth muscles, for instance. Okay? We also have other receptors in the vascular smooth muscles. Histamine 1. We have histamine 1 receptor in the vascular smooth muscle. Vascular smooth muscles, so vessels, so sa blood vessels. I am referring to the blood vessels. Now, um, okay, tama. So as you see, you have different receptors. Tama? Different receptors are involved. Epinephrine binds to alpha 1. Histamine uh, histamine binds to histamine 1 receptor. So again, different. It's a different receptor involved. But they would carry this opposing effect. Okay? For epinephrine binding to alpha 1, it would cause vasoconstriction. And then for histamine 1 binding to histamine binding to histamine 1 receptor, it would cause vasodilation effect. Okay, so antagonism, counteracting each other's effect by binding to a different receptor. So different receptor, alpha 1, histamine 1, but opposing yung effect. Now, whenever drugs binds to the same receptor, that antagonism is known as receptor antagonism or pharmacologic antagonism. So example, epinephrine ulit. So I've mentioned it has affinity to these adrenergic receptor, beta 1, 2, and alpha 1. Okay, let's extract another subtype of a beta receptor, let's say beta 1. Okay, so epinephrine, yes, it has affinity to beta 1 and its effect is sa heart, di ba? Sa beta 1 in the heart, it will cause tachycardia. Okay, again, I'm talking about those beta 1 receptors found in the heart. So whenever epinephrine binds to that beta 1 receptor, it will cause tachycardia. Whereas we have blockers of these beta 1 receptors. Diba? All beta blockers, they have affinity to beta 1. Okay? So, what would be the effect? Depressant effect, and that is bradycardia. So, same receptor, beta 1 receptor, but they have opposing effect. Okay, so same receptor, opposing effect, that is pharmacologic antagonism. And then lastly, chemical antagonism, purely chemical reaction happens. So one substance will try to inactivate the other substance. So example, protamine. Protamine is the antidote during heparin toxicity. Okay, so it will just uh, counteract heparin via inactivating heparin. Okay, and that is a neutralization reaction. And then for deferoxamine, it will counteract iron, okay, during iron poisoning via chelation. Diba? During iron poisoning, it that will be counteracted by deferoxamine via chelation reaction or complexation. Okay, so purely chemical reaction happens to oppose the effect of another substance. Okay, so these are the type of antagonism based on mechanism of action. And then based on type of interaction, we have reversible interaction and irreversible interaction. It has something to do with the bond that connects antagonist to a receptor. So let's say you have an antagonist, as it uh, as it binds to the receptor, this bond forms, if it is weak bond, if it is a weak bond, a weak interaction, then that will cause a temporary interaction, or a temporary, reversible interaction. Okay, so example of a weak bond would be those non-covalent bond. Okay, another type of antagonism via or based on the interaction of antagonist and receptor, irreversible. So this time permanent. Permanent yung bonding because this time the bond that connects antagonist and a receptor, it's a stronger bond. It's a covalent form of bond. Covalent bond. So kumbaga ang antagonist, it is covalently bonded to the receptor. It's a strong bond. A covalent bond is a strong type of bond. Okay. And then we also have a last one, type of antagonism based on surmountability. We have competitive, meaning surmountable, non-competitive, non-surmountable. So when it is competitive, if the effect of the antagonist can be surmounted, can be overcome by increasing dose of agonist. So for example, you have here a receptor, and then the action of this antagonist, it can be counteracted if we increase the dose of the ago. So if that is the case, then competitive yung antagonism can be surmounted. We simply increase the dose of the agonist. Non-competitive antagonism, if this time the uh, okay, if this is the active site, no, active site of the receptor, okay, this time the antagonist, instead of binding to the active site, it binds uh, to the other site of the receptor, particularly in this site known as allosteric site. Okay, so this time the antagonist binds to the allosteric site of the receptor. So during non-competitive antagonism, allosteric antagonist binds to the allosteric site. If that is the mechanism of binding ng antagonist, that will cause changes in the conformation. It will cause changes in the conformation. Okay? So, mangyayari, mag-iiba yung shape ng active site. So, let's say from that shape of the active site ng receptor, mangyayari, let's say, ma-change na siya. Okay, so you have here the antagonist bound to the allosteric site. So due to conformation, due to changes in the active site formation of the receptor, you cannot overcome anymore the effect of the antagonist even if we increase the agonist concentration. So you cannot overcome anymore, the antagonist effect, even by increasing the dose of the agonist. Kasi what happens, there is already changes in the conformation of the active site of the receptor. So that what happens if allosteric antagonist binds to a receptor. Okay, so non-competitive, non-surmountable yan na type of antagonism. So again, recalling all of them, type of antagonism, we have based on mechanism of action, the functional, receptor, and chemical antagonism. Based on type of interaction, reversible and irreversible. Based on surmountability, we have competitive and non-competitive. The one that can be surmounted is uh, that is via increasing the agonist. Okay, that's the one that can be surmounted if we can overcome the effect of the antagonist by increasing the dose of the agonist. Okay, and then if it involves already allosteric antagonist, then that's non-surmountable, non-competitive. Okay, then last slide, we have the following theories about receptor drug interaction or ligand receptor interaction. The hypothesis of Clark, maximum pharmacologic effects. It is obtained if all receptors are occupied. Okay, so kumbaga yung magnitude of the effect that the receptor will produce, that will only happen if all receptors are being occupied by ligand. Hypothesis of Peyton, or also known as rate theory, maximum pharmacologic effect, it does not depend on the occupancy of the receptor, but based on the stimulus. So based on the stimulus naman yung theory niya. And for Arians and Stephenson, or the occupancy theory, maximum pharmacologic effect, it will last as long as receptor are occupied. Okay? So these are the theories related to drug receptor interactions.